background about myself. If my slides advance. There we go. I grew up in Florida and did my bachelor's at Florida State University. And I mostly have focused on botany in my training. And so sort of have come to entomology roundabout through an interest in plants. And then I did my master's at Humboldt State University, which might be up in the part of the world that some people might be viewing this from. And then recently completed my PhD at UC Davis last year. And like I said, I'm now located out here in the middle of this giant landmass in Fort Collins, Colorado. And much of my work has focused on bumblebees. I have sort of a general interest in fire ecology and how plants respond to fire, plant pollinator interactions in general. But a lot of my work has focused on bumblebees as the study organism, including my dog dressed as a bumblebee for your viewing pleasure.
Put your mouse up toward the top.
There's about 250 species of bumblebee worldwide.
That row of bars at the top. Click the leftmost smallest.
Candace,
bar.
is it possible to mute?
Yeah, I think that people are not mute. Can everybody mute?
So yeah, there's about 250 species of bumblebee worldwide. Bumblebees, as suggested by their large bodies and fuzzy coats, have the highest diversity in mountainous regions of the world. So some of the highest species diversity is in the mountains of Asia. In North America, we have pretty respectable diversity with about 50 species of bumblebee. Bumblebees are, of course, important pollinators of wild plants, and provide us with the pollination services needed for lots of crops, especially some economically important crops. They exhibit this interesting buzz pollination behavior, which allows them to get pollen out of porocidal anthers, or anthers shaped like a tube. And I didn't put a picture of it, but I think more importantly than agriculture, bumblebees just add to the beauty of the natural world, both through themselves and the flowers that they visit and are important in the reproductive success of. So I'm going to give you a smattering of some past research that I've done before moving on to some current stuff. But this is me, I think, early in my dissertation in the Sierras in California. And a lot of the work that I did, I really wanted to do work where I went out with a bug net and stood in beautiful places, because who wouldn't want to? But what I became really sort of frustrated with and then interested in was this problem with bumblebees, where you can go out to a place and you can collect a bunch of individuals and maybe say what species they belong to, or talk about the interactions that they're having with flowers and other organisms on the landscape. But you can't answer, are these 5 bumblebees, are they from 5 different colonies, or are they 5 individuals from the same colony? How far did they fly in order to get to where you observed them? Because it's very difficult to locate bumblebee nests. And one of the ways that we can get around that is by taking genetic samples from all of these bumblebees, determining which ones are siblings, and then doing all sorts of math and ecological statistics with that in order to understand things like how many colonies we're looking at, or how far apart those siblings are separated in space. And with that kind of information, I was able to determine the foraging range of a few species of bumblebees, and basically was able to determine that while previous efforts using mark recapture of bumblebees suggested very short foraging ranges in mountainous areas, using this genetic mark recapture method, we found much longer foraging ranges. Oftentimes, colonies were found foraging further than 1 kilometer. And And additionally, we were able to determine things like colonies, like say this individual here, we detected her sibling far apart across large areas of forest, suggesting that the habitat is not broken by forested landscapes, basically. That's not a ton of context on that work, but just trying to give you some flavor and keywords for things I've done before. And like I said, and possibly just due to the existence of doing any ecological research in California, I found myself studying fire. And so I looked at how bumblebee populations and pollination systems, how they were affected before and after fire. And once again, just to give you some flavor and keywords here, basically in a first bit of research, we found that after some fires in the coast range of California, we found that flowers bloomed for longer periods of time and that bumblebees were far more abundant on those blooms. We also found that because there were larger plants following fire, outcrossing rates were reduced because bumblebees and other pollinators were moving more often within plants rather than between plants. And then lastly, in addition to knowing that their bumblebee individuals were more abundant, using that genetic marker capture data, we were able to determine that those bumblebees came from more colonies, so a larger population size. We also saw that bumblebees had larger bodies in areas that had recently burned because there were more flowers, so colonies were receiving better nutrition. And then lastly, there was such a boom to the bumblebee population within the burned areas that those reproductive spilled over into the unburned areas. Like I said, this is not typically how I would walk people through any particular projects, but if you want to ask me at the end about recent fires or fire ecology and how pollinator populations might respond to that, or you have insight on that, I would love to discuss those things. But where we're going to turn our attention to now is bumblebee conservation more generally, and talk about some of the bumblebee species and populations that are of current real conservation energy. And so as you may be aware, there are reported declines locally and globally of bumblebee populations and species. You may have seen headlines like this, or images like this mass die-off after a spraying event in Oregon. But bumblebees, just like any number, I think, of insect taxa on Earth, the real story is how little we still know about them, or how little we are yet to learn about them. And so this is a map showing species diversity of bumblebees by different geographic units. But these gray circles show that for the vast majority of bumblebee species, we don't have a conservation assessment of them yet. So there's still a ton to be known. Earlier, I said that the highest species diversity is in Asia, but no Asian species have an IUCN listing, basically. Here in North America, or at least where I am, I heard in the business that there may be some international viewers, but in North America, where we have 47 or 50 species, depending on who's counting, about 26% of those species are listed as some sort of threatened category according to IUCN criteria. And so understanding the causes of those declines in bumblebee populations and how we can recover them is critically important, of course. But I would also argue that even for the species of least concern, there's going to be localized threats to populations that's important to know about. So a species that may be considered relatively stable may, in a landscape like, say, the California Central Valley, be declining within that area, and the loss of that species locally may affect pollination services to crops or wild plants. So still a ton to learn, basically. And bumblebees, of course, being organisms on planet Earth, are affected by things like habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, pesticides, fungicides, and also herbicides indirectly through plants. Bumblebee populations are threatened by disease, which can be introduced as novel pathogens from managed honeybee colonies or managed populations of other bumblebee species. And of course, climate change is also a substantial threat to bumblebee population stability. And all of these factors, of course, and rather unfortunately, can also affect populations interactively. At present, a lot of the focus and energy, I would say, on bumblebee conservation in North America is centered around the Rusty Patched Bumble Bee, named for its adorable rusty patch on its abdomen, of course. The species, Bombus affinis, is the only federally listed bumblebee species at present, and the only federally listed bee species in the continental US. There are 7 species of Hyleus bees listed in Hawaii. But other than that, Bombus affinis is the only federally listed bumblebee species. And so it serves as sort of a first opportunity to figure out how we're going to manage bumblebee populations under the Endangered Species Act, or mismanage populations, depending on how it goes, I suppose. Declines of the Rusty Patched Bumblebee were suspected to begin in the late 1990s. And this is likely through an introduced pathogen is sort of the leading hypothesis. But the species formerly was present throughout all of this gray area in the northeastern United States. It was never the most common bumblebee throughout the range, but it would have been rather unremarkable. It would have been among the more common species. Today, it's present only in the upper Midwest, as well as a few scattered populations in the Appalachian Mountains. The species was proposed for listing in 2016 and then ultimately listed in 2017. And since 2017, there's been a big influx of research and funding for that research, as well as information to come out of this region on Rusty Patched Bumblebee, but also on bumblebees in the Midwest, sort of more generally as a result. Often just because we go out to look for the Rusty Patched Bumblebee and we need to publish things, so we just have to collect data on other bumblebees and hope that that's a proxy for their decline. I don't know if it's effective or not in that regard. A little closer to where some of you may be located out west, there were also, and I say were, 4 species being petitioned for listing under the California Endangered Species Act. And when I made this slide a few months ago, they were being proposed. So I went through and just crossed it out because, as you may have read, this petition, at least this time, was not successful, though I'm sure there will be legal challenges to that. And these species are also going to be of great interest for bumblebee conservation over the next several years, I'm sure. And they include species like Bombus crotchii, which likely is affected substantially by habitat loss in California Central Valley. Bombus franklini, which I'm sure few people have ever seen to begin with, because it has a very restricted range in Southern Oregon and Northern California. I would do immeasurable things to see Bombus franklini. That would be wonderful. Bombus occidentalis is also going to be of great interest. 30, 25 years ago, Bombus occidentalis would have been the most common bumblebee in the West Coast, and now can still be found out here in Colorado, though in much lower abundance. And then Bombus sucklei, a parasitic bumblebee, is also of great interest and also being petitioned for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So now I'm going to kind of do like a talk within a talk. And so this is about a specific project that I worked on, sort of the first project I worked on after my PhD. And it's using some long-term data, plant data available to us from the Illinois Natural History Survey, and is work that relies on the massive effort of many botanists that I'm extremely grateful for. Before we go any further, just so we all have a shared understanding of the bumblebee life cycle, if not already present, bumblebee queens emerge early in the spring as solitary individuals. So they don't have a worker caste. Instead, they're solitary individuals carrying all the sperm and eggs that they need for their full reproductive cycle. They forage and collect pollen and nectar to establish nests, typically underground. After basically provisioning enough resources, they then are able to produce their first cohort of workers. The colony grows through successive cycles or cohorts of workers until the colony grows to a large enough size to produce new queens and males late in the summer or early in the fall. Those new queens and males leave the colony, mate hopefully with individuals from different colonies, and then the males and all the workers and everybody except the new queen perishes, lasting only a short duration, and the new queens overwinter underground. But really, for the purposes of what I'm about to tell you, the thing I really want to stress is that these queens emerge early in the spring, and then the colony develops and grows, demanding more and more resources all the way into late summer and early fall. So bumblebees have a particularly long flight season, and need resources over a very long portion of the year. Since I'm speaking to entomologists, I feel myself thinking of caveats to this, of course, as I say it, but generally they have very long flight seasons. So, we can talk about populations or species in Greenland too, I suppose. So like I said earlier, bumblebees are threatened by a variety of factors, but for right now, we're going to focus on habitat loss. Habitat loss is, of course, an important threat or stressor to many organisms on Earth. And bumblebees are susceptible to habitat loss in a variety of ways, in large part due to the fact that they need a lot of resources. And habitat loss can, of course, interact with other stressors and ultimately impede our recovery efforts. So earlier I hinted that the Rusty Patched Bumblebee and other bumblebees might be susceptible to introduced pathogens. And if, say, for example, we were to find a way to manage those pathogens, but we don't have good, high quality habitat to reestablish populations in, we're going to be playing a very poor game in the future. I think typically when people think about habitat loss, and I know this includes me, we have something in mind like this map. So over here on the left, we have Illinois in the early 1800s. So a landmass comprised of largely prairie grasslands and forests along riparian corridors. But present day Illinois is much more of an agricultural landscape dominated by corn and soy, of course. And it's definitely important to consider land conversion as the main form of habitat loss. But as far as the Rusty Patched Bumblebee is concerned and other recent declines of bumblebees are concerned, this land conversion happened decades prior. So in the 1990s, when Rusty Patch started declining, Illinois was already covered in corn and soy. Instead, there might be something a little more cryptic occurring here, and that can be the loss of habitat quality. So it may be that an area of land was forest and always, or at least in recent history, always was forest, but the amount of floral resources, so the quality of that habitat for bumblebees, may have declined. And we can't see that from satellite data. In order to see changes in food abundance on the landscape, we need long-term monitoring data. And it would be great to have that long-term data. And thankfully, because of the hard work of the Illinois Natural History Survey, we do have long-term data of plants all across Illinois. So Illinois, as part of their Critical Trends Assessment Program, or CTAP, has been sending brave botanists out into the wilds of Illinois for 23 years now. And this program has monitored plant cover in forests, grasslands, wetlands across Illinois since 1997. And I think one of the really cool things about this monitoring program is that the sites are located on private land. So the sites actually represent sort of your average habitat in the state, rather than, say, representing like the best restored prairies or only state parks or something like that. They represent your everyday habitat in Illinois. And so the botanists, when they survey, they collect data on all the plant species that occur at the site, but we're going to focus on plants that are used by bumblebees. And so to do this, we filter the survey database to look at plants used by bumblebees generally, as well as a subset of plants that are preferred by the Rusty Patched Bumble Bee, since it is our charismatic ambassador to the bumblebees for now. And so we asked, how has bumblebee food plant abundance or richness changed within these grassland, forest, and wetland habitats? And the first thing we're going to look at is changes in plant abundance. And on the y-axis here, we have a relative mean cover. So basically how much of the site is taken up by bumblebee food plants and how that has changed over time. And what we find is that in forests, there's been about a 5% decline in bumblebee food plant abundance. Whereas in grasslands, we get kind of a mixed result, with bumblebee plants generally remaining stable, but plants preferred by bumblebees increasing in the grasslands. And then in wetlands, we have basically a flat line, more or less. Plant richness, when we look at plant richness in these same sites, what we find is that forests do not have a continuous linear decline in bumblebee food plants, but recent surveys show that there's been a substantial drop in plant richness for bumblebees. It's likely driven by a few sites losing a lot of plants, because it's not as if, you know, plants lose or sites lose a half a plant, right? We can get into the details there if needed. In grasslands, we've seen actually an increase in bumblebee plant richness. And like I said, these are private lands, but private lands do participate in various conservation restoration programs sometimes. So this could be a signature of success of those restoration programs. And in wetlands, we see, once again, just sort of no change in bumblebee plant richness over time. And I want to stress that these results are based on within habitat changes. So there still may be losses of grasslands or reforestation of parts of the landscape, for example, but within a given forest or grassland, we're seeing changes. So generally, or overall, what we're seeing is a decline in bumblebee food plants within forests and an increase in bumblebee food plants within grasslands. So we're seeing sort of declining bumblebee habitat quality in forests and increasing bumblebee habitat in grasslands. And I don't want to say this is an encouraging result as far as biology goes, but it's an encouraging result as far as statistics goes, because this is a really large and noisy data set, but we're finding a result that others have documented, that Forest flowers are declining due to factors like overbrowsing by deer, invasive shrub encroachment, and canopy closure due to increasingly crowded forests, basically. Some people may be thinking, or wondering, who really cares if forest plant abundance declines as far as bumblebees are concerned? Bees live in meadows. And in fact, if you do a search for pollinator habitat on Google, you will be rewarded with a bunch of pictures of plants blooming out in the open in the middle of summer. And of course, these massive sources of food in the middle of summer are very important for bumblebee populations, but there's more to the story here. Because like I said earlier, bumblebees have a particularly long flight season. And so it's worth asking how different habitats might contribute seasonally to bumblebee food availability. So that's what we did. Basically, what I'm going to show you here in this next figure is kind of a flowering curve representing the average amount of food available to bumblebees in different habitats throughout the season. And when we do that, what we find is that in those grassland and wetland sites in Illinois, they certainly have the most food for bumblebees, but that food isn't available until the middle of summer, right? This peak is out here on day 225, which I think is somewhere around July 30th or so. But while they have the most food, forests have the earliest food abundance for bumblebees. And if we overlay museum records of different bumblebee casts, what we find is that queen bumblebees are out on the landscape at the time that forests are in bloom, whereas the other casts are out on the landscape when grasslands and wetlands are predominantly in bloom. Now, I should say that when we look at this figure and I say that queens overlap with forests, we don't actually know if these queens are using those forest resources because this is museum data overlaid plant survey data. And at present, the Illinois Natural History Survey does not survey for bumblebees, though I'm trying to lobby for that pretty hard. And the Forest Service specifically discourages people from surveying for bumblebees in this region early in the season in order to avoid disturbing populations of queens. But that also means we don't have good data on queen bumblebees as a result. But what we can do is use images from community science projects like iNaturalist, Bee Spotter, Bumblebee Brigade, there's like 12 others, Bumblebee Watch, etc. And when we do that and we pull a bunch of images of Rusty Patched Bumblebee queens, and it should be noted that the Rusty Patched Bumblebee queens do not have the rusty patch. When we pull images of those queens, and there's not many because they're very rarely seen, but oftentimes we find them foraging on plants that are found in forest understories or forest edges. And this is really exciting, but our research technician as of 4:48 p.m. sent me these figures. So you're seeing like brand new data. How crazy is that? And these are from some surveys Jade did last year in Wisconsin, so not Illinois, but she did surveys last year in Wisconsin looking for queens. Didn't find a ton, but despite distributing her effort evenly throughout the landscape, most of the queens she observed were in woodlands or grassland and woodland edges. And most of the plants they were foraging on are found predominantly in woodlands, labeled here in green. And I circled this one because it's a reminder to myself to ask what's up with that, because I actually usually associate Hydrophyllum virginianum as being a forest plant, but you know, they're very fresh results. So this is encouraging that what we're seeing in the data is correct, that bumblebee queens rely on these forest resources, discouraging when you remember that forest resources are declining. And like I said, bumblebee workers and males are more numerous in the landscape, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're more important. So while queens are often less observed, some recent research, mostly from lab studies, suggests that queens and small or young colonies are unlikely to ever recover from early season food shortages. So basically, no matter how much food they get later in life, if a colony starts off with poor nutrition, it never recovers. It never has sort of the same vigor as a colony that started off with strong resources. So it's really important to focus on where queens are getting food in the landscape. So from this particular project, I started to think, we need to consider habitat quality, not just quantity. And a big component of quality is where in the season or when in the season that food is available. And forests as potentially the easiest queen habitat to produce are worth really thinking about and may be threatened. And of course, I find long-term monitoring efforts to be particularly splendid. But I started writing up these results and thinking about this project, and I started thinking about how they fit into the bigger picture of bumblebee conservation. And this is where this talk could potentially just go like totally off the rails, but I think I got it figured out. But you start digging into the literature to contextualize what you've learned, and you realize things are pretty scattered when we think about bumblebee conservation beyond flowers in the middle of summer. Let's say there's really not. There's certainly some great natural history work on queens and things beyond sort of that midsummer foraging period. But the bulk of the research really isn't focused on those sections of the life cycle. And so to borrow a comparison from discussions with Elizabeth Crone, when I think about bumblebee conservation, I think about leatherback sea turtles. And the reason that I think about them is because of this classic example of baby sea turtles. And basically all these conservation efforts where folks were organizing these mass volunteer events where people would help guide baby sea turtles to the ocean in order to address population declines of sea turtles. But then somewhere along the line, some intrepid math modeling nerds came along and determined that no matter how many baby sea turtles you save, even if you save every single baby sea turtle, you cannot reverse population declines by saving baby sea turtles. Instead, the most effective way to conserve the loggerhead sea turtle populations was to save reproductively mature individuals, was to save adults. And so that led to the implementation of TEDs, or turtle exclusion devices. And so when we save adult sea turtles, we see reverses in the declines of populations. And so the way that relates to bumblebees or pollinators generally is I look at these pollinator plantings blooming in the middle of summer, and I wonder, these are probably good, right? They're definitely providing food. They're blooming away in the middle of summer. They look great. They feel really great. We put them out there and we see lots of bees on them, so they must be working. But I'm not convinced we're necessarily getting the most bang for our buck. So at this point, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying we shouldn't plant flowers that bloom in the middle of summer, but I would hate for it to be all that we focus on. And so I worry that maybe pollinator plantings are sort of like focusing exclusively on baby sea turtles. Instead, maybe if we focus on forests or whatever other habitat bumblebees are using at different parts of the season, early or later in the season, that might be more like our turtle exclusion device. And mostly I've been talking about foraging resources at this point, but I hope in a couple minutes you'll understand the importance of forests for nesting and overwintering habitat as well. And so lately I've been thinking a lot about whether or not we're overlooking the importance of forests in bumblebee conservation and the role that basically woody habitats can play. And so I've been messing around with this team of bodiless individuals here on the right. This is that bumblebee life cycle again, but updated, and this is made by Jeremy to show the variety of ways that bumblebee populations and bumblebees interact with forests throughout the season. So early in the spring, when those queens emerge, they might be foraging on tree pollen or on understory plants. Later in the year, their colonies may be growing within cavities available within forests. And then late again in the fall and winter, they may be overwintering in forested habitats. And these things, I should say, are all a lot harder to see than putting out flowers on the landscape in the middle of summer and then going and looking on those. And here's one of these graphs where people type into Web of Knowledge any set of keywords and find that there's exponential growth of literally anything that you type into Web of Knowledge. But yeah, when you type in bumblebees to Web of Knowledge, you see that there's an exponential growth or near exponential growth in the number of studies about bumblebees. But when you add conservation, you see that bumblebees and conservation is a growing topic of concern. But oddly enough, the number of studies on bumblebees in forests holds just kind of steady throughout time. There's like studies here and there. And I thought this was really weird. I've read a bunch of papers about bumblebees and I feel like I have a flavor for when forests might be important. And I realized part of it is because for some reason, if people have done a study about planting hedgerows or something, they tend to put the word hedgerow right in the title. But this study at the top here is about basically how Bombus terrestris gets 80% of its pollen early in the season from trees and understory plants in the forest. But the only word about habitat in here is agriculture. And then I'm apparently also guilty of this because I cheekily named a paper Fantastic Bees and Where to Find Them. But actually I could have just named this paper We Found Bumblebees Overwintering in Forests. And that would have been more descriptive perhaps. But when you do look into that scattered literature, basically what you find is that there's a bunch of figures that look like this. Bumblebee abundance increases as forest cover in the landscape also increases. And I found these results in disparate places like Canada and Estonia, Japan, Germany, etc. It should be pointed out though that these surveys are conducted in the middle of summer typically. So each of these points might represent, say, a meadow or a grassland or some sort of open habitat that they're observing individuals in, but that suggests that there's something about forest in the landscape that improves that local habitat as bumblebee, basically a compatible bumblebee landscape. So perhaps while they're doing their surveys in the middle of summer, bumblebees were using those landscapes at different parts of the year. But there aren't many studies that directly go out with the explicit premise of understanding the relationship between forests and these pollinators. We've started to dig around with some data using about 50,000 records from the Bumblebees in North America database. And it turns out when you have 50,000 records, you can make like a lot of figures. And I'm now going to walk you through each figure individually. Or not, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to focus on a couple here, but basically, these are the top 5 land covers that each bumblebee species is associated with in the database. And this is me choosing Bombus affinis because it's of conservation concern, Bombus terricola because it's of conservation concern, a couple common bumblebee species in the Midwest, and then I chose Bombus pennsylvanicus specifically because it is thought of as an open habitat specialist. And really the only thing I want you to get here is that deciduous forests are the most associated land cover with all of these bumblebees if you remove urban or anthropogenic habitats. So if you remove developed habitats from here, deciduous forest is actually the #1 associated land cover. There's a caveat there that like a ton of the Earth's surface has been converted to agriculture, and anthropogenic habitats are the dominant habitat. But you know, this is preliminary, and we're starting to get a flavor for things here. So we've talked about foraging, but also I suggested bumblebees or forests may be favorable habitat for nesting and overwintering of bumblebees. This literature becomes even more scattered, even more anecdotal, though it does mean that I get to read natural history papers, which are my preferred papers. So that's kind of nice. But just to give you a quote from a recent review of the limited number of papers on bumblebee nesting, Amanda Lixner and Sheila Collar state wild nests were most commonly found in forests. And that's an encouraging result when we put it all together. And there was also a recent study in Ohio where they didn't find bumblebee nests, but they found bumblebee queens while they were searching for nests, and found that basically as the amount of forest in the landscape goes up, they observed more bumblebee queens searching for nests. And some really recent work, it's it's posted as a preprint and under review, comes from Elizabeth Crone and Jenny Pajesic. And in this plot on the left here, what they found was actually that the amount of nests they were able to find of bumblebees in Massachusetts was not actually that different between meadows and forests. They found about the same number of nests per hectare in meadows and forests, but they took it a step further and they looked at the reproductive success of those nests. And what they found was that the reproductive success of nests within forests was 3 times higher than that of nests located in meadows. And it's important to point out here that these are relatively fragmented forests. So the bees don't have to travel very far to get to the open habitats for foraging later in the year. But it does suggest there's something special about their nests being located in forests. And I want to also add that within the manuscript, they discussed that detectability of nests in the forest was also lower using their mark recapture methods. So it may be that actually they're underestimating the total number of nests within forests. And I just want to say this is like radically cool research, because I love it when somebody takes it beyond just, you know, observing numbers of individuals, but actually looks at that reproductive success. I think that's what we're supposed to do, but it's actually so hard to do. And when we dig into overwintering, there once again becomes even less really detailed information, but basically I've been encouraging people to send me incidental observations of bumblebees that they find overwintering or in pursuit of overwintering habitat. And what this photo collage is supposed to impress upon you is that most of these bumblebees are existing within duff and litter layers and basically existing under trees and in forested habitats. So this particular multi-panel, I think you can see my mouse as I move it around. Okay, I see a nod. In this particular multi-panel, we dug around in forest understory, under cypress trees in Monterey, California. We dug in grasslands, and we dug or in grass habitat adjacent to those cypress trees, and in underneath ice plant. And basically, we only ever found bumblebees overwintering in the cypress. So if the idea of digging around and looking for bumblebees and mostly failing, but maybe occasionally succeeding appeals to you, I would encourage you to go to queenquest.org, where you can either log your incidental observations of bumblebees that you find overwintering, You can find survey protocols for how to do your own bumblebee overwintering dig, and advice for where to look perhaps, and how to enter your data, and other helpful references and stuff. And this heat map down here shows all the different places that people looked for bumblebees last year in 2019. Though I will be honest with you, we had nearly 30 teams look for bumblebees, and only one in Pennsylvania was successful in finding them. That is why this data is so hard to get, but it's so critical. And I should have included the video, but it was Michelle Duenis's class at a small college in Pennsylvania. They all looked, and there's this great video of Michelle running across campus to go join the students who had successfully found some Bombus impatiens overwintering in some sort of hardwood litter layer. Yeah, and so this is great because we're getting a little bit more information every day, even if most of that information is absences. And additionally, I don't want to get into this, but I'll say quickly that there's also a variety of abiotic factors in forests that can be favorable for pollinators. They can serve as windbreaks, thermal refuges. I just learned today about a study from 2013 in Oregon, which found higher bumblebee abundance in aspen groves than in adjacent grasslands. And those authors suggest perhaps one of the reasons for that was because those aspen groves served as a thermal refuge later in the summer. And forests can also serve as pesticide drift mitigation. And some of this is reviewed in a great review by Bentrup et al. In 2019. So to bring you to some sort of conclusion, I wanted to reiterate this comparison between pollinator plantings and baby sea turtles. I certainly think it helps, and it may turn out that it's the most effective thing that we can be doing to conserve pollinators. But right now, because we don't have good demographic models, or really any demographic models for bumblebees and most bee species generally, we don't actually know that it's the most effective thing that we can be doing. And so I encourage us to think about other ways that we can support bumblebee populations, and really to focus on queens. And if we want to focus on queens, perhaps the easiest way to do that is to really focus our conservation efforts on forested landscapes. This also has the great benefit of conserving forested landscapes and all the other myriad of organisms that can exist in them, which I think is fantastic. And it stresses me out a bit to think that we're not necessarily focusing on these habitats as key pollinator habitat after knowing and learning more about how we may be losing resources in those habitats. So at this point, I will thank you for listening and take any questions or comments or whatever.
Thank you so much. That was very, very informative. Yay.
Yay.
Do you know anything about survival after fire? Like, are they protected underground if a fire passes over?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, but I can speculate. And in my dissertation work, where we looked at, we had some genetic data available to us before fire, as well as some after fire. We did detect some queens who very likely had survived fire into the following year and then established colonies, but we can't really be certain of it because the sample sizes are so low, and the precision of exactly where a nest or an overwintering site for that matter is using genetic mark recapture techniques is very low. It's really good at knowing the spatial separation between siblings, and then we can kind of assume things from that. but knowing exactly where that nest is located or that overwintering site is located, we don't really know. So I think in the paper and typically when talking about that topic specifically, I like to stress that we know, fire was beneficial for a common bumblebee species, which if there was mass mortality could easily recolonize the area. But if we were thinking about a species like the Rusty Patch or particularly sensitive habitat for another species, the recommendation would be to leave a portion of the landscape unburned if you're doing a controlled burn, because we can't guarantee that there would be a local population for recolonization. Yeah.
Thanks.
And I guess I would also add Jim Kane does have some work looking at solitary bees and their survival at different depths under simulated fire scenarios. And it seems like mortality would be pretty low. But I haven't seen a similar thing for bumblebees. And like I said, we know so little about the depth that they overwinter at that it's hard to say.
Brad asked the question, do you have any tips on how to find bumblebee nests outside of the Rusty Patch range?
Yeah, so I'm going to reference Elizabeth Crone again. Basically, she has a good mark recapture method for finding bumblebee nests, assuming you have somewhat of a team to go look. But in a simplified version of that, basically, if you go to a place and you observe very carefully, if you see bumblebees flying vertically rather than horizontally, those vertical movements are done during nest entrances and exits. And so that would suggest the presence of a nest. But really, the main way to find bumblebee nests is to spend a really long amount of time on a piece of ground and really carefully look for those vertical movements.
Thanks. Any other questions for John?
I have a general question about bumblebees in general.
Yeah, of course.
It looks like everything you talked about is in the genus Bombus.
Uh-huh.
Is there other genera of bumblebees?
No, so all bumblebees are in the genus Bombus, though at this particular moment, I'm blanking on whether or not Cytherus, the parasitic bumblebees, are currently considered a subgenus or their own genus. It seems to move back and forth.
So
Yeah,
how many species would there be in the world of Bombus?
about 250 species, or
Okay.
262 according to Paul Williams' website the last time I checked.
Okay. And my other question was that I noticed that they're completely absent in sub-Saharan Africa, even though there's high mountains down there. Do you have any thoughts about why that is?
My bumblebee biogeography is not as sharp as I would like it to be to answer that question. Yeah.
Well, maybe a word to that. They are clearly a holarctic element, so they're more Nordic. And the ones in South America, they just go along the Andes, and there are just very few species kind of in a more tropical part of South America. And also in Southeast Asia, they are not in a tropical part. So I think they just never made it. They just made it in Asia or in South America in the high altitudes more recently, and they just never crossed that in Africa because they don't like the desert either. So I think that's kind of more historical thing. But this is just a gut feeling.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that gut feeling. Yeah, there aren't really even the bumblebee species that I can think of in the more arid regions, the diversity gets very low, and those tend to be very high elevation arid regions even, so not particularly warm, which doesn't necessarily match the pattern of bee diversity generally, which can sometimes be particularly high in arid regions.
And there might be also the competition by the carpenter bees, by Xylocopa, which are very common and species rich in Africa, and they are big bee-like things, which like similar flowers or so. So maybe there was also too much competition there.
Yeah.
While I'm speaking, you pointed out that there's a lot of decline in bumblebees, and recently you hear in general pollinator decline and everything, but sometimes I got the feeling, and again a gut feeling, that the bumblebees are harder hit than most other solitary bees. Is that substantiated, or is that just a feeling, or?
I would say that's somewhat of a gut feeling that I have too, but unfortunately that's kind of all we have to go on is gut feelings, because for the vast majority of solitary bee species, we have just so little data.
Yeah.
And then oftentimes, we're going out into landscapes that have already been massively altered. So we're already sort of observing the winners of a mass reshuffling of those communities. So I would say there's reasons to suspect that solitary bees might be less susceptible. One of those reasons perhaps being that often solitary bees have shorter flight seasons. So they rely on less continuous resources. So one of the things that makes bumblebees really susceptible is that they don't store large amounts of pollen or nectar in their colonies, unlike, say, honeybees, which store large amounts of honey. So they really can't handle resource droughts for very long. Whereas for a solitary bee, they probably can't handle resource droughts for very long either, but because their foraging window is so short, sometimes just a few weeks, it's kind of less likely that they would even experience a gap in nectar or pollen on the landscape. Yeah. There's also the problem, with some bumblebees that, like the Rusty Patched Bumble Bee or Bombus occidentalis, that there are managed species of bumblebee, like Bombus terrestris and Bombus impatiens, which are used for greenhouse tomato pollination and other agricultural pollination contexts. And those species can result in, the movement of novel pathogens into native populations. So you mentioned South America. In South America, there's the native Bombus dalbomii, which is a very large bumblebee species and particularly gorgeous. But its populations have been increasingly replaced by introduced populations of Bombus terrestris, a European species. So I think that sort of presents a unique source of competition for bumblebees, as well as a route through which disease can be spread across the globe.
Another question from the chat is, would a bee that has had an overwintering nest in one habitat ever move and establish a summer nest in a different habitat, like move from a forest to a grassland?
Yeah. So once again, we don't have great data on it, but there's reason to suspect that, because we're observing some species appear in the limited data that we have to be really generalist nesters, but there's not so they may nest in grasslands or woodlands or even in cavities high up in trees, etc. But then those same individuals may be overwintering in a completely different habitat type. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
John, I have a question. I just wanted to see if I got your general view of fire correct. So if fires come in, they can then lead to increase in the flowers in open areas, which are important resources for the bumblebees. And as long as they don't decrease the forest habitat, then would be generally beneficial. But if we get fires that are so frequent that they're actually reducing the forest habitat and converting it into, say, an open grassland habitat, that would probably not be so beneficial, right?
So I guess I would start by saying, fires are massively complex and varied. So you have crazy different intensities and temperatures and really different severities. But there are a few studies, both of the ones that I can think of right now are from Europe, which suggests that basically the best configuration for bumblebees would be open habitat surrounded by, a matrix of patches of forest. So yeah, like hypothetically, if a fire completely leveled all the forest in an area and made a completely open habitat, that probably would be undesirable for most bumblebee species, or at least undesirable for promoting, sort of peak bumblebee diversity. But fires that move through forests, thinning young trees and resulting in more open canopies and therefore richer understory flowering, probably would be beneficial, assuming that all overwintering habitat isn't wiped out or something like that.
Great, and of course here in California, people are talking about manzanitas being early season flower resources for bumblebees. So would the same sort of go for the chaparral if you're you have fires in chaparral, as long as it doesn't wipe out everything?
Yeah. And I didn't go into this in this presentation, but I'm sort of viewing forests as the most convenient way to provide early season resources, because they're sort of the habitat that I'm using it as a catch-all for sort of woody plant species. And in some ways, there's some research, and I'm sure just everyone's anecdotal observation, that would show us that in some ways, kind of like urban habitats or garden habitats also have really early flowering resources. Some really well-managed historic prairie have really early flowering resources that flower just as early as forests. But those are not as sort of common habitats as forests are in a lot of places. So it doesn't necessarily have to be forests. It's just sort of that forest is the best, most available thing that we have, if that makes sense. Yeah, and in a place like the foothills of California, where manzanita dominates and is a really abundant early season flowering resource, yeah, that's going to be a great resource for bumblebees.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Al.
Yeah. Yay. That's all. Thank John for
Thanks so
joining.
much.
Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you.
Great talk.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I have a question for Kathy.
Yes.
I just want you put the online renewal in the chat. I know last year at this time, we had a little bit of a concern about the envelopes going out. Are the envelopes going out again this year?
I think they already did.
Oh,
Yep.
they did, okay. Okay,
You should have one by now.
okay, good to know.
Yeah, it went out with the last edition.
And
Wait, what's it
pack,
called?
yeah.
Episode.
Okay.
The last publication we mailed.
Check the back, under the back cover of the last pan pack. Huzzah!
Tucked in there. Yeah. All right. Well, have a good New Year, everyone.
You as well.
If you guys have ideas for speakers or other activities we could do, I'm all ears. So,
Well, I think we had a wonderful speaker this evening, and if he has any ideas, I'd love to hear it too. Really,
I do.
enjoyed that talk, and I'd like to
you.
hear more. And I notice Ian Pierce is one of your co-authors or
Yeah,
readers. Yeah, where?
Ian is he is technically my advisor, though despite living like a mile apart, we haven't seen each other in months. Actually, that's not true. We got coffee last week from slightly.
Okay, so
farther.
you're in Colorado now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So tell him hello from me
All right.
and Kathy Schick.
I will write your name
Hopefully he'll remember me as a very galling person.
down. Well, he likes gulls.
I know. That's why I that's how I know him.
Great. Yeah, in terms of speakers, if you do want, Candace, I think you're on the Young Pistols listserv.
I'm not in that, but maybe I should.
Okay. We can talk about that. I moderate a listserv of early career pollination and pollinator ecologists. So we would have a big long list of enthusiastic people who I'm sure would love to chat with y'all.
Well, it was a delightful talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really digging that In Star Wars shirt, by the way.
Well, you have Florida, I believe, so that's where I got this one. But they have some pretty good shirts over there.
Yeah, my high school grades were not good enough to get into the University of Florida. I went to Florida State and then
You always
realized
go
I
visit
I
now.
like school. All right, I'm gonna go
Excellent.
eat some dinner. It's nice chatting. with all
Exactly.
y'all.
Me too.
For coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for the talk.
Bye-bye.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Night, everyone.